Hello, students of European history. Today's lecture is on Eastern Europe from 1945 to about the year 1982. There's some things that happened after 1982 that really change everything. And when we're talking about Eastern Europe from 1945 to 1982, including the Soviet Union, we're looking at a state that is, questionably Marxist. Is it Marxism? Is it a kind of socialist state or socialism? For a while, of course, the question is it Stalinism? Whatever the heck all of those words mean, could be any one of those things. Certainly, Stalinism up until Stalin dies in 1953, and then things change as well. But we'll kind of have a look at how Eastern Europe becomes a part of the Soviet sphere, becomes a quote unquote communist area, and what advantages and disadvantages that brought. We'll look at the way in which some of those states from time to time tried to break away from the Soviet sphere. And then we'll just kind of look at the Soviet Union itself. So let's have a look at this, getting started with Eastern Europe in this Stalinist period from the end of World War II until the death of Stalin in March of 1953. By the way, there is a movie, I think it's on Netflix now, called The Death of Stalin. It's supposed to be a comedy. I should have enjoyed it. I did watch it, but for some reason I didn't think it was that great. But check it out if you want to. Well, in 1945, you might remember that there was the meeting at Yalta and then the meeting at Potsdam, in which the United States and Britain were trying to convince Stalin of how Eastern Europe should be after World War II. And Stalin promised elections that would be free and self-determination of the peoples and all that kind of stuff. Probably had no interest or really no plan to do any of those things. He's just negotiating with bad faith, probably with Churchill and Roosevelt or Clement Attlee and Harry S. Truman. Anyway, when elections do happen in Eastern Europe with Soviet troops occupying them, the elections are really quite fraudulent, and very quickly you get to a one-party state. In fact, you get little Soviet unions being created with Stalinization, with a leader who is in charge of the place, and then, economically looking at a 5-year type plan to try to speed industrialization, just like the Soviet Union did in the 1930s. Eastern Europe is, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, a place that really didn't have a whole lot of industry, and so that is really quite necessary. Also, in terms of agriculture, they also go through collectivization, which was just as unpopular in these Eastern European states as it was in the Soviet Union when it happened in the 1930s. Basically, a one-party dictatorship, repression of other political groups and dissidents or people who are against the government and against the system, and then really quite a bit of dissatisfaction with Stalinism. In Western Europe, you would have the Marshall Plan, and you'd have a rebuilding, a rejuvenation of the economies of Western Europe under capitalism. Eastern Europe, those things aren't happening, and so people's day-to-day lives with consumer goods and so on are not quite what you had in the West. In 1948, there was a coup in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia stays a multi-party state until then, but there is a communist coup in 1948 that ends the multi-party system, and so Czechoslovakia becomes part of the Soviet sphere as well, and once again with a one-party state and Stalinization, all that kind of stuff going on. There were 3 revolts in Eastern Europe, and there is a thesis that I want to repeat to you over and over again. It's a thesis not only for this period of time, it's a thesis for the end of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Basically, what people wanted was freedom, more freedom, the kinds of bourgeois liberal freedoms that democracy bring, and then a better standard of living. And if you can remember freedom and a better standard of living, that's going to go really quite far in explaining what happens in Eastern Europe, either things that fail or things that eventually succeed. So in 1953, there was a revolt in East Germany. In 1956, one in Hungary. And then also in 1968, one in Czechoslovakia. We'll deal with each one of those, although they are kind of similar, to be quite honest. In 1953, the government was, still paying reparations to the Soviet Union. They are allied yet. Stalin and the Soviet Union expect something from the Germans, their former enemies, who are now supposed to be friends. They were trying to pay reparations to the Soviet Union. They had to tell the workers that they would have to work harder for the same amount of wages. The workers didn't like that, and so they basically kind of rioted, or they had demonstrations against the government and basically against the occupation by the Soviets too. The Soviets put these down. You can imagine how freaked out they were that the Germans who they had under their control, the Germans who had invaded them twice in the 20th century, were rising up and perhaps, going to be joining their comrades in the West or what have you. Soviet troops put this down violently in bloody repression, and this doesn't really do anything for the East German state, for making it popular. And over time, about 3.5 million East Germans left East Germany, or the eastern sector that the Soviet Union controlled, and went to the west, went to the three western sections of occupied Germany, or what becomes West Germany in 1949. Once again, they're leaving because they believe that West Germany is going to provide them with capitalism. It's going to give them economic opportunity. It's going to give them the consumer goods that they want, and it's going to give them democracy. It's going to give them more freedom. The people who were leaving, as you can imagine, were people who could make more money in a capitalist system. They aren't the simple workers or the simple farmers who maybe don't own land or don't like collectivized agriculture. And so it's kind of what they call a brain drain. The people who are smarter, the people who are more ambitious are the ones who are leaving, and they're leaving behind the people who are just okay with kind of mediocre working lives and not really owning anything. Well, that's going to be bad for the state. And so in 1961, the Soviet government and the East German government get together to start to build a wall between the western part of Berlin and the eastern part of Berlin. Basically, the wall goes all the way around West Berlin. And then there's already a border, a fortified border between East Germany and West Germany. Now, the East Germans say that this wall that's created is a so-called anti-fascist protection wall. They say that they are protecting communist East Germany and East Berlin from fascists who were never taken out of power, or Nazis who were never taken out of power at the end of World War II. This is really pretty ridiculous because obviously all of the guns and the mines and the dogs and the barbed wire and the walls and everything else point out towards the east, and they don't point inward towards West Berlin. So they're obviously trying to keep people from fleeing the east into the west, rather than protecting anybody from alleged Nazis that were still in power in West Berlin or elsewhere. Here are pictures of the East German uprising. On the left, that's the Brandenburg Gate. You can see these East German working class people with a German flag, black, red, and gold flag, wanting to not be controlled by the Soviet Union and maybe to become a neutral state or part of the Western Sphere, either one. And then on the right, you see a couple of guys throwing rocks at Soviet tanks. This is a really bad idea. Never throw a rock at a tank. It doesn't serve any purpose other than to make the tank aware of your presence, and you probably get run over or shot. So don't do that. 3 years later in Hungary, there was a leader of Hungary by the name of Imre Nagy. It looks like Nagy. He is a communist, but he's a more liberal communist. He wanted to open up the economy. He wanted to open up the political process a little bit. In other words, like I said, looking for more freedom, and then looking also for a better consumer life or better economic lives. He was pushing for this. Stalin was dead by this point in time. Stalin dies in 1953. There was a secret speech that was given in around this period of time that suggested that Stalinism was dead and Stalin had made some mistakes and so on. Maybe that's what encourages this guy to push for democratization. He pushed too far, though. He went so far as to talk about leaving the Warsaw Pact, or leaving the military alliance that the communists were all held together by. And when he did that, that was more than the Russians could take. The Russians felt like Hungary was slipping out of their sphere, and so they sent in tanks. They brutally repress any kind of move towards liberalism, democratization, and change in the economy, basically. Spirit Imre Nagy out of Hungary and then execute him. Something happens afterwards to get the Hungarians sort of back on the side of communism. It might remind you of the NEP, the New Economic Plan of 1921 that Lenin and others were doing. In other words, a little bit more capitalism, maybe a little bit less planned economy. There's this thing that the Hungarians do called goulash communism. It's just a little bit more liberal than what you might find in other places. Thinking about what people might like in terms of consumer goods and giving them maybe just a little bit more freedom. So they both crush this democratization and liberalization that was going on in 56, but then also afterwards kind of ease up just a little bit. Here are some photos from that period of time. A number of Hungarians are able to flee at this point in time. You can see a Hungarian tank filled with people on top. You see people with signs and marching. You see a giant Stalin head that seems to be damaged in some way. That's kind of cool. And then there's a guy standing on a tank. I'm not really sure what his deal is. He looks to me to be a reporter, but he also looks to me to be Inspector Gadget, if you guys remember Inspector Gadget. Czechoslovakia has their own kind of anti-Soviet revolution in 1968. As I said, in 1948, there was a coup that destroyed the multi-party system or the democracy that they had going on. 20 years goes by, and a man who was in charge of Czechoslovakia at this point in time, a guy by the name of Alexander Dubček, wanted to also make socialism a little bit more palatable, a little bit more free, a little bit more liberalism, and he started to do what he called socialism with a human face. After all, socialism aims to take care of people. Why is it that there is all of this repression? Why is it that walls have to be built to keep people in these nations and so on? Is kind of what he is asking. Well, this was not allowed, and in 1968 there is an invasion not just of Soviet troops, but also of troops from the Warsaw Pact invading Czechoslovakia. After this, there is a doctrine that is invented, legalized, whatever you want to call it, called the Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev is the leader of the Soviet Union at this point in time. And the Brezhnev Doctrine is kind of like the Truman Doctrine. You'll have to think about what the Truman Doctrine was all about, and then think about what the Brezhnev Doctrine does. But the Brezhnev Doctrine says that in any state, in the Soviet sphere, that where communism is threatened, the Soviet Union and others could intervene to keep that state communist. Think about the Truman Doctrine and think about whether that's the same. I like the cartoon here. You see the Soviets in 1945 as liberators of Czechoslovakia from Nazi terror, and the little girl then is bringing the Soviet soldier flowers. And then 1968, really quite a different relationship with the Soviet soldier, who apparently has shot down the little girl. Here's some more scenes. You probably think, and you might be right, that I have a room next to my barricade room where I have all of the pictures of the barricades of 1848. I have another little closet that is filled with crowd scenes and people standing on or around armored vehicles. I have odd hobbies. This is Czechoslovakia in 1968. You can see all these Soviet tanks occupying Prague, for example. An interesting example of a state that doesn't belong to the Western or to the Eastern alliance is the state of Yugoslavia. The Eastern European states that were taken over by Stalin had all been, quote unquote, liberated from Nazi control or Nazi alliance by the Soviet Union or by the army. And Yugoslavia is a state that was invaded by the Germans, but it frees itself from Nazism. It frees itself from the German army. It was liberated, so to speak, not so to speak, it was liberated by some nationalists and some communists. There is a guy by the name of Tito, or calls himself Tito, who was a partisan leader or a guerrilla fighter in World War II, and he becomes the nationalist communist leader of Yugoslavia. That might freak you out a little bit to think of nationalism and communism. I'll say that again with other people like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. I think you can imagine that somebody could be both a nationalist and communist, even though usually those things are complete ideological opposites. In other words, they are communists because they want all the people inside of their country to be equal with one another and have communism, but they're also nationalists in the sense that they love their country and they want the best for their country. So I think it does make sense, even though, communism usually says working men of the world unite. He breaks with Tito breaks with Stalin, doesn't listen to Stalin, won't obey Stalin, and he won't obey the Common Form, which is the successor to the Comintern, the Communist International. This Common Form is the umbrella organization of all the communist countries and all the communist parties throughout the world. They have this break in 1948, and then they're just doing their own thing. They're a neutral state in between East and West, and they profit from that. They can have some of their people leave Yugoslavia, go and work in the West, bring back Western currency, and their economy is a bit better than what you have in Eastern Europe because of that. Tito is very successful in squashing ethnic and religious divisions that go on, especially between the Serbs and the Croatians, Serbians being Orthodox, and the Croatians being Catholic. You would think, too, in a communist country that wouldn't really matter very much, but people still hold on to some extent, their religious beliefs. And Tito himself has a Serbian parent and a Slovenian parent, so he's not just a Serbian guy, for example. And so Tito carves out, and Yugoslavia carves out, this fairly successful existence between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, and profits from both. More about Yugoslavia later. Getting into the Soviet Empire, getting into East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria and so on, and the Soviet Union, quite frankly, what we have is some progress both in society and the economy from where we were at in the pre-war period and going back, many hundreds of years. Just like in the Soviet Union, workers and farmers were given advantages. They were advanced in society. People who wielded the hammer and the sickle were put at the top of society, and the old aristocrats and bourgeois people, of course, at the bottom. Women, too, were given equal rights in the Soviet Empire, Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. I have quotes around equal because although women are officially able to do everything that men are able to do, there is still misogyny. There are still remnants from the past of men being superior to women, and although ideologically they're equal, it doesn't really work out that way. In fact, if you think about it, if a woman works and a man works in an industrial economy, let's say in the Soviet Empire, and they both come home at the same time, they pick up their kid from the state-run childcare. Guess who's cooking dinner? Guess who is cleaning and all that kind of stuff? Probably the woman, just based on tradition. Industrial development was promoted in the Soviet Empire, as I said. Communism, the Marxism, wants workers and wants industry, and so that too is done. They're still behind Western Europe, though, in many respects. Obviously, there are no freedoms of speech and belief and travel and any of the other kinds of bourgeois Enlightenment kind of freedom that you might be thinking about. And then also a lower standard of living. There isn't competition in a planned economy, and so there isn't an improvement of consumer goods. There aren't people trying to fill consumer niches of various kinds. I like to say there's only one brand of cat food, for example, and there's no advertising for that. So there's generally a lower standard of living in planned economies or in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of these people had nationalism. They didn't want to be part of the Soviet sphere. They wanted, as I said, more freedom. They wanted a better standard of living, and they are repressed. They're kept down for a good 45 years or so. The Soviet Union after World War II, if we want to get into that for just a bit, they have a great deal of rebuilding that goes on. They have reparations from East Germany and reparations from Eastern Europe. They also have quite a bit of slave labor. They kept a lot of the German prisoners of war, and then they went to East Germany and stole even more people, basically forced them into the Soviet Union to repair the damage that the Germans had done. After World War II, there is a kind of economic boom. The Stalinist heavy industry economy is going gangbusters as they're rebuilding and creating, more and more factories and more machines and more locomotives and rail and all those sorts of things. They're doing so in order to, fulfill plans, fulfill goals that really have to do with mining more coal, drilling for more oil, producing more iron or steel, and that sort of stuff. They don't really get into producing consumer items. That's not what their industry is all about. It's almost as if their industry is created to create more industry rather than to fulfill, people's various kinds of desires for consumer goods. Population was also booming in 1939. It was about 170 million people. Subtract, sadly, 20 million people from World War II. Still, by 1967, there were 234 million people living in the Soviet Union. The social welfare state is greatly responsible for that. People felt comfortable having children, and after war, there's a kind of baby boom as well. The Soviet welfare state, including everything that was going on in Eastern Europe, really has a lot of advantages. It is a kind of, in many ways, a fake economy, or a controlled, planned economy. And so prices aren't real. Prices aren't based on supply and demand. They're based on whatever the government says they are. And so there's almost free housing. There is, free healthcare. There's free higher education. There's almost free public transportation. There are many cultural opportunities that are nearly free. The kinds of stuff that you and I would have to pay a fortune for example, going and seeing a concert or a play or what have you, is nearly free in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Great ability to go to see movies and so on with entertainment, also, like I say, nearly free. And the poverty that had existed in the 19th century and before in Russia or in Eastern Europe was basically eliminated. And for a period of time, there was increasing prosperity. People are doing better than they had been doing in the 30s or the 20s or the teens or in the 19th century. So going up into the late 1960s, lives were better than ever. But the negative side of this planned economy is, it's just providing the basics for people. The goods that people have available to them are shoddy or of low quality. There is very little choice, because as I say, there's only one brand of cat food. And oftentimes there were shortages that led to long lines. People had to wait outside of a store for a long period of time in order to get into the store, and then they would find that there were only like 4 products that were available. It's really difficult, I think, to plan for an entire economy, and then just incompetence and corruption and so on means that you might walk into the store and only have 4 things available. People would buy those 4 things as much as they possibly could, and would exchange things with neighbors that had gone to a different shop and found different things. People really hate this. There's no point, there's no purpose to waiting in lines and having shoddy goods. When in Western Europe or in the United States, that doesn't exist at all. Of course, all kinds of freedoms, once again, were prohibited. Freedom of religion, any kind of ability to dissent or to be against the state or against the any ideas or so on is really quite discouraged. And then, of course, no travel is possible. Travel within the Soviet sphere is possible, and that happens a lot. Different people go to, Bulgaria. They might go to the Black Sea coast, for example, if they're East Germans or Poles or Soviets or whatever they happen to be. But there is no travel outside of the Iron Curtain, and that bothers me. There is a guy by the name of Nikolai Khrushchev, who reigned from the death of Stalin until 1964. In 1956, like I said, he went in front of the bigwigs of the Communist Party and told them what they all knew, that Stalin was a bad guy, that Stalin had, persecuted people needlessly. He was responsible for the deaths of millions and so on. He criticized Stalin's personality cult, and things really change after 1956. It's no longer a Stalinist kind of state. It is certainly repressive and so on, but it isn't, shoot you in the head kind of repressive. They reduce the number of people who are in the gulags or the prison system, but you can see in 1956 when Hungarians rise up, they are crushed. A couple of notable successes of the Soviet Union during Khrushchev's reign would be the launching of an artificial satellite that was going around the Earth, which was called Sputnik. That was 1957. All it did was really beep, but it freaked out the United States pretty well because we were behind the Soviet Union at that point in time. We hadn't launched anything into orbit at that point in time, and then Soviet Union was also beat us in the space race in 1961 to put a man in orbit. Yuri Gagarin is the first human being in orbit after the United States and the Soviet Union were shooting monkeys and dogs and things like that into orbit. Really, the beginning of the end of Khrushchev's reign is during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October and November of 1962. Basically, the Soviet Union was trying to put nuclear weapons or rockets into Cuba, just off the coast of the United States. And we caught them doing that, or we saw that they were doing that, and then had to stop that. We didn't want the Soviet missiles in Cuba so close to the United States. President Kennedy at this point in time was given advice that maybe he should bomb Cuba. That probably would have started World War III and led to a nuclear exchange. So instead, does something which is really quite clever, blockades Cuba, keeping the Cuban or ending the Cuban Missile Crisis as Soviet ships that had the rockets and so on them got to the American blockade, and instead of crashing through the blockade and once again causing World War III, they turned around and went home. Backing down in this way was the beginning of the end of Khrushchev's reign. The person who took over from Khrushchev was a man by the name of Leonid Brezhnev. This guy was in power for much of my young life. He was the only Soviet leader that I ever knew up through 1982. And under Brezhnev's reign, you really started to see a kind of stagnation of the Soviet Union. This is kind of going on in Western Europe and the United States too, maybe just a little bit later, starting in the early 70s. But in the Soviet Union, you had government rigidity and economic stagnation and repression. People were no longer satisfied with what they had, with the basics. They wanted more. People kind of silently protested or quietly protested. Some people who raised their voices, the dissidents, people like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, were repressed. Sakharov was the father of the hydrogen bomb program in the Soviet Union, and he turns against the militarism and dictatorship of the Soviet Union over time. And sadly, they decided that he was insane. He wasn't, but they made the argument anyone who was against the Soviet Union would be insane, and they put him in a mental institution. Where there's also Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a soldier in World War II, said something indiscreet about Stalin not knowing everything, and ends up in the Gulag system as well. He is a person who writes about life in the gulags, and that gets smuggled out to the West. Smuggling literature in the Soviet Union, critical literature is called samizdat, and people would create written works, type them basically themselves, and then sneak them to friends, and maybe a friend would sit down at a typewriter and also make a copy of that, and this would kind of circulate around. Samizdat is an important means of quiet protest. There are no printing presses or photocopier machines or anything like that people can use to do that. You might remember too, I talked about détente, a lessening or a decrease in Cold War tension, and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of 1972. So we do start to see under Brezhnev's reign a kind of lessening of tensions between the United States or Western Europe and the Soviet Union. There's Leonid Brezhnev. That is a very, very flattering painting of him. He is not a handsome man. There are Andrei Sakharov on the left and Alexander Solzhenitsyn on the right, the dissidents that I about. Solzhenitsyn actually is expelled or exiled from the Soviet Union, and he ends up, I think, in Connecticut, spending the rest of his life there as a kind of recluse. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They wanted to keep Afghanistan as part of, or put it into the Soviet sphere, and they wanted to make Afghanistan a communist country. This is probably the least most likely thing to happen ever in world history, trying to turn Afghanistan into a into a communist country, thinking of industry and working class people and all those sorts of things. If you know anything about Afghanistan, and so the Russians do that. The United States responds. We're really quite angry at their naked aggression, and so in 1980 we boycotted the Moscow Olympics and really just disappointed a lot of our own athletes. And in 1980, the communist world really won those Summer Olympics because they didn't have any competition from the West. A number of people. I should go back to Afghanistan for just a second. Afghanistan becomes for the Soviet Union very much like what Vietnam was for the United States. It's a place where a lot of troops get bogged down. It's an impossible war for them to win. It looks like an imperialist war against a defenseless people, but they're not defenseless. They kill a lot of Soviet troops, and we'll talk about how that gets worked out later. In 1981, the guy on the far right of your screen, Ronald Reagan, a Hollywood actor, was and governor of California, by the way, was elected president of the United States. This comes after what they call the malaise years of Jimmy Carter, where the United States felt like a lot of people in the United States felt like Carter was weak and the United States has gotten weak. And President Reagan comes in and on a platform, an election platform of rearming the United States. He wants to create a sizable military again, and he does a lot of what I call saber rattling, talking about the Soviet Union as an evil empire and confronting the Soviet Union rather than détente being what's going on. There's really this sort of bellicose or aggressive speech about the Soviet Union and getting rid of it. As a part of that, there's a mini arms race in Europe. The Soviets had already put more modern nuclear rockets into Eastern Europe, pointing at Western Europe, pointing at the United States. And so the United States wanted to respond in kind with a new kind of missile, the Pershing II missile. And Western Europeans didn't like that. Western Europeans listened to all the rhetoric of Reagan, and they felt like Reagan was willing to fight a nuclear war in Europe on their soil, especially after the United States started to pursue something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, what everybody just called back then Star Wars. And what this was a system of anti-missile missiles and killer satellites, and with the purpose of being able to destroy Soviet nuclear weapons in flight or destroy them before they could nuke the United States. A kind of nuclear shield was the plan, and a lot of research went into that. It never comes into full use or isn't successful, and yet the United States was spending a lot of money on this. The Soviets get worried that the United States will be able to create this Star Wars defense system, which means that the United States could launch a nuclear war against the Soviet Union, and when the Soviets responded in kind, all of their missiles would be shot down, and the United States wins a nuclear war. Well, there was obviously growing disparity between the capitalist and communist worlds going into the 1980s. And what you saw was slower economic growth in the communist system. They weren't really sure how to make the economy hum along. They didn't know how to make people work harder, I guess. There were really very few incentives for people to work harder. And so in the 1950s, there was a 6% growth rate, which is really robust, which is really great for any nation. Any nation would be just overjoyed to get 6% growth nowadays. And by the 1980s, it had shrunk down to about 1.5% economic growth, which, quite frankly, is still pretty good for a lot of the world. But, you probably have to imagine, too, that maybe these numbers are fudged, not because you get shot in the head as, the manager of a tire factory or whatever, but just because, people want to fulfill their plans. And so the question became, how could the Soviet Union really keep up with the West, keep up with Western Europe and the United States economically and technologically and militarily? It is starting to fall behind. You could even just think about computers, personal computers, and other kinds of computers that are starting to come into existence in the late 70s, early 80s that the Soviet Union just doesn't have a hand. And so, looking at the communist bloc, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, from 1945 to about 1982 or so, officially it's a Marxist state. Just like what Marx said, but really, let's face it, it wasn't a Marxist state at all. It is really a group of socialist dictatorships. They're trying to take care of people, but in doing so, they have to be, really dictatorial and authoritarian. I wouldn't really call them totalitarian in the same sense that Stalin was totalitarian or Hitler was totalitarian, but nonetheless, these are dictatorships. They do provide cradle to the grave welfare states. You're going to be completely taken care of in this kind of a system. But once again, no freedoms, no bourgeois freedoms that we got used to coming into the 19th century and the 20th century in they are unable in the end to match the capitalist economies. And this is going to be one of the two things: no freedoms and not enough consumer goods or not enough economic opportunity are these two things that are going to doom it eventually. However, and this has to be emphasized. They are worthy adversaries for the West. There is a lot of fear in Western Europe and in the United States of communism and of communism expanding and taking over the whole world. And so, for a period of 45 years or so, the Soviet Union is a very worthy adversary for the West, and very scary, quite frankly. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and do the reading and do the reading quiz. Thanks so much. Bye bye.